Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Gordon. On behalf of the Millstein Center at Columbia and ECGI and Deloitte, I'd like to welcome you to this event on Board 3.0, bringing the private equity model to the public firm. This is a notable event in many ways, but certainly one of them is how we've attempted to convert some of the limitations that still exist in the present, our inability to share a common physical space, into a strength, because we've been able to bring together a remarkable group of speakers and such a large group of participants throughout the world. This we might not have been able to assemble in what might be called the before times. Often I've been at a conference with the law professor types, and rarely we've had one or two senior folks from the industry, but they're hard to get. Today, we are fortunate to have senior parties from major asset managers, folks with deep experience in private equity, and directors on public firms. Apart from the potency of the Millstein Center and the ECGI brands and Deloitte, who can resist the invitation to spend all or part of your day in a Zoom meeting? I suppose it does beat taking a plane flight. I want to call attention in special ways to the ECGI and the Millstein Center. What's remarkable about the ECGI is that in less than 20 years, it has become a central player putting together discussion and debates in this field. Yes, it's a European, the European is in its name, but as this conference and others demonstrate, it has become a central facilitator of many important discussions that occur in the global space. The Millstein Center has its own pride of place that shows how one visionary leader, Ira M. Millstein, can enlist, excite, and harness to good ends the efforts of others over a sustained period. I worked with Ira at the Columbia Center for some time, and one is steadily amazed and inspired by his ongoing keen attention to changes in the world and the openness he brings to new ideas and his constant concern about the future. There are over 600 signed up for this event, literally from all over the world. And it's great to be able to share the discussion we have today in such a broad way, and then afterwards to make available recordings and write-ups trying to add to the global debate on these questions. It has occurred to me that these events attract such a broad following because they are, in fact, global governance discussions. Stock ownership transcends national borders. The economic performance of large firms and the local disruption that may follow their actions become of first-order political importance throughout the world. How firms internally govern themselves, how they might govern themselves in a different way, perhaps better, thus become part of the global governance debate. Before ending this introduction, I want to express particular appreciation to the staff of the Millstein Center, Erica Klein and Bree Hinrichs, and the folks at ECGI, Elaine Partland and Marco Beck, and to a longtime supporter of the Millstein Center, Deloitte. I think we have a great day ahead. First up, actually, is Ron and me to set forth, I guess, the question of the day. So let's see. I think actually I am on first, and so let me share slides. Okay. So one thing I want to call attention to is that the title, we've broadened the framing of the discussion today. So the private equity story is very important, but as an example of a broader theme that in working through our own ideas, we've come to realize is, in a sense, the core, which is how to bring innovation and experimentation to the public company board. The private equity case that we develop is an example of that, but we don't mean, in a sense, it's the only way that change might occur. And so the plan for the day is to study whether a particular governance strategy that's been part of the success of PE can be usefully ported over to address issues in public company governance. That's one point. Then secondly, to understand in a foundational way the evolutionary fit between the business carried out by firms and the public company governance that is associated. So we see governance and business goals and challenges as linked together. And then third, to establish additional alternatives for public company board structure that we will collectively call Board 3.0. This is an ambitious agenda, and we'll see how far we get with it. So the taxonomy we developed here is Board 1.0 and 2.0 and 3.0. One of the points we want to make is why we seem to be locked into Board 2.0. The main feature of which is the part-time independent director. And so the reason that this model has been locked in, ossified perhaps, is several. First, the board model we have is associated in time with a long period of stock market appreciation. So there's a success by association, even though financial economists in their own work have struggled to find a causal link between board structure and economic performance. Secondly, as we look historically, the board model, the Board 2.0 model is overlapping agreement among critical players in the governance space, right? Managerial elites, the institutional shareholders, the Delaware courts, and the SEC. This is where they came to rest as a common point of agreement. Board 2.0 also seems to provide a suitable place for the development of the taking on, the devolvement to this board of a series of public enforcement responsibilities. So this board is well suited for sort of a devolution of that sort. An additional point is the network externalities point, which is to say the lock-in of this board comes in because its persistence, its widespread use, set up behavioral norms and precedents that essentially instruct directors as to how to guide themselves in role An additional reason for the lock-in here is how the sponsors of low-cost portfolio products consider stewardship, which is to say governance guidelines that will maximize value on average and thereby increase expected returns of the portfolio as a whole. Notice that governance tailoring would require firm-specific analysis, costly to do. And if you're a portfolio investor, maybe you get better firm-specific returns, which are but idiosyncratic. And ordinarily, as a portfolio investor, idiosyncratic returns are not particularly important. So in a sense, the tendency is to have the guideline approach on average what's best and not look at bespoke reforms. And finally, the transition costs from a different board form are potentially high. So those are strong features that attend to the ongoing nature of Board 2.0. But sure, we're having some screen sharing issues, so that's all right. We'll switch off. But on the other hand, there are issues here. The shortfalls in the present board model are too compelling to ignore. For example, we see issues in the way that this board model deals with market pressure in an era of concentrated ownership. The large institutional investors simply don't seem to trust boards enough to allow them to credibly signal management quality. So that's one issue. The Board 2.0 model may be insufficient in the face of increased business and organizational complexity of the large global firm. And boards are beset with a time crunch. How do they address the fundamental strategy issues while at the same time working on increased compliance oversight responsibilities? So next slide, if somebody else is running this. All right, so the point being, even though there is a lot going for the Board 2.0 model, it is a success in many dimensions, not to take away from that. Nevertheless, these shortfalls, these issues suggest that there is space for an alternative board model that might offer significant ways to enhance the functioning of the board in addressing these challenges of economic and organization. Now, so it's not like when we think about alternatives, we write on a clean slate. There's a lot of experimentation out there. The PE model that we have discussed in some of the material that I hope you've had a chance to look at, that's obvious, a very strong example of an alternative form that has success. But there are various VC-funded startups. There are organizational forms that address the disintegration supply chain. And within these governance alternatives, there's an increasing amount of economic activity, and the economic returns from these alternative governance models are really substantial. So the point being, if there can be alternatives to the Board 2.0 model, optional alternatives that will increase the value of these firms, then we may reduce the migration of economic activity to private markets and thereby broaden participation in economic success. Most of us don't have the access to private market investments. If we can come up with a better version for the public firm, then there's a positive distributional element to the case for board 3.0. So next slide. All right, and so how do we go about this? We offer historical evolutionary account of how we got to board 2.0, and in that sense suggests that evolution can go forward in looking at board 3.0 variants, including the empowered director model that we discuss today. To be clear, what we're not doing, board 3.0 is not a stakeholder board model. And so in a sense, we have a normative view that bringing onto the board debates about the distributional issues inherent in the stakeholder model would not enhance the effectiveness of the board in dealing with the economic challenges of a dynamic competitive environment. And secondly, this is not a separate case for greater board diversity. So diversity will have value, we think, in any board model. And the reason for that, if we can expand the pool of talented, insightful, and committed potential investors, that will be a great thing for board 2.0 and any 3.0 variant that we can imagine. So, right. So let's talk about evolution and board evolution. The point to be made here is we see boards all over the place. There's management and there's the board. Yet historically in the United States, boards have actually varied quite a bit. And one way to think about this is really in evolutionary terms. A board model gets established as a functional adaptation to the current business environment. What happens then is that the board model becomes entrenched. The environment may change, but the board retains its present form until the benefits outweigh the costs. And then again, in the evolutionary story, again, there's a deteriorating fit between the entrenched board model and the current environment crises, and this may open the way to innovation and even thoroughgoing change. I mean, you don't need an asteroid hitting the Earth to sort of imagine that there's a moment in evolution when one board model becomes so important in its adaptations that it replaces another. All right. All right. The model here, the evolutionary model that we described, the epochs are two. There's board 1.0 early in the century. There's board 2.0 beginning now. So what are the main drivers of the change? And one is the relationship between the firm and the capital markets, including whether the firm depends on market access for finance, the structure of ownership. So that's one feature critical to the overall environment. Another point is how the firm is growing. Is it organically or through M&A? And therefore, what's the importance of coordination among units that are newly added to the firm? A third point, as we'll see, is the development of management as a specialized profession, the role of government here, the rules involved, which can in some circumstance replace government functions, and in other circumstances add to the functions of the board. And then also there's background rules as to how much flexibility internal governance will permit a board to have. So next slide. All right, so how would we describe board 1.0? Maybe go back. Prior slide. Right, so the board 1.0 is a model that brings together insiders, elite financiers, elite business folks, and others. And the flourishing of this model is associated with an organizational innovation, the rise of the large public firm, especially industrials and utilities, and the rise of the professional manager. Now, by a large firm, what I mean is literally the first time that US firms, apart from the railroads, had national scale that to take advantage of the national market created by the railroads and communication advances. And these firms were put together through M&A, through the horizontal deals and the vertical merger waves that historians know about. What are the issues that these firms must solve? And in a functional sense, what are the issues that the boards must help them solve? And so one of the issues to be solved is the access to the markets to issue stock and to issue debt, which permits specialization and risk bearing and permits the founders to diversify. So that's an important business issue for these firms to solve. The firms need to achieve in a successful way M&A activity. They have to successfully do the horizontal integration. They have to successfully do the vertical integration. They have to integrate these fiefdoms, the discrete business units, into a whole. And they also need to bring in specialized knowledge both to do that and also to develop the firm. So next slide. So the point is, the board then plays a particular role in the organization of enterprise. It's a management tool tool by which the corporate mashups involved in the creation of national firms can be integrated large-scale firms while retaining market access and the credibility to markets and gaining experience and advice. And so the function the board plays in the creation of these large firms explains who's on the board and what the board does. So we've got insiders from the diverse business units trying to integrate them in the firm. We have elite financiers because the reputation they bring bonds the reliability financially of the firm. It enhances the ability of the firm to access capital markets. You have senior executives at other firms who bring in specialized knowledge, and you have advisors. So the board is created in a way to deal with the business dilemma of a firm that is creating a national footprint. And so we see this both in the work of some at the time, Burley and Means, who naturally see the board as part of the management of this firm. And Chandler, a business historian, in effect sees the board 1.0 pattern as in place by the 1920s. The next slide. And sort of a neat example, a powerful example of this, of the board 1.0 is GM. So we have the leaders of organizational thinking in the United States, Sloan, Pierre DuPont. They create the modern business firm in the United States, departmental structure, the M form. GM was a large board firm. In 1935, they had 34 directors, 16 were senior officers. And the point is, Sloan used the board as CEO as a management device to impose a centralized management structure and coordination on a far-flung enterprise. So the board becomes a vehicle of managerial governance, not corporate governance as we think of it today. Next slide. Now, part of what happens here is this decreasing lack of fit between the board 1.0 and the ongoing environment. First, we see as a matter, we get the federal securities laws, which require disclosure, which have the anti-fraud rule. This replaces, in effect, the elite financiers who are there to provide sort of a reputational bond as to the reliability of the firm's financials. If you've got the federal apparatus doing that, the role of those elite financiers becomes much less important. And similarly, as these firms begin to retain a huge amount of earnings, the need to go to the markets becomes less important. Next slide. Similarly, there's internal growth within the firm. So instead of the inside directors being a way to integrate the firm as a whole, the firm builds from within, inside. There's a hierarchy that the CEO controls. There's a bureaucracy within the firm that has access to knowledge and planning that in the prior iteration was especially important at the board level. Indeed, management consulting brings knowledge to the firm that directors might otherwise have brought. And so in effect, the board becomes a moat that is just, it doesn't just coordinate, it protects the imperial CEO. And this, and you can see a glimmer of this story in what the GE board has become by 1955. The size is about the same, but it's almost entirely an inside board, which consists of not only the current officers, but also the former officers. So it's obviously a different kind of board than was important in putting together GE as a single enterprise. Next slide. Okay, so then we see, again, the way the crises begin to strike at the legitimacy of the 1.0 board. We see, prior slide maybe, I think we skipped one. We see the failure of Penn Central. That was a particularly important failure. We have a blue chip firm that unexpectedly, at least to the directors, failed. Sort of barely, the ink was barely dry on a massive dividend payment when the firm went into bankruptcy. There was also, and then we had this other issue about the illegality undertaken by management under the very eyes of the board. So we've got a disillusionment about the business performance of the firm, and then about the core law obedience of the firm under the board, the passivity of the board 1.0 model. Next slide. And another business failure, again, under the oversight of the 1.0 board, was the spread of the conglomerate form, in which we ended up with unwieldy business firm, beyond what management could control. And management used manipulation of merger accounting conventions. The point was, it was managerial empire building unchecked by the then Board 1.0 model. And all of a sudden, the solution of the separation of ownership and management, which was a great solution in the 20s and 30s, now becomes an issue. Agency costs arise because what was once seen as a solution is now a dilemma. And then we have literature, Miles Mace widely read book, which shows how passive directors were and shows the failure of the Board 1.0 advisory model. So this clears the way for Board 2.0. And then secondly, we've got the illegality, the payments that these firms made as well, which suggests that the 1.0 board failed in its compliance or didn't think it had compliance oversight duties. So next slide. All right, so we have in a sense, a collapse. The intellectual consensus that sustained the Board 1.0 model now collapses. It's really like an asteroid hitting in a certain way, just slowly over time. And the 1.0 model gets replaced with the monitoring board model, which an academic, Mel Eisenberg, had proposed, but all of a sudden, when the evidence failure of the 1.0 model becomes apparent, this alternative model is heralded not only by the Democratic chair of the SEC, but also the Business Roundtable and the bar. Boards, first we see them taking on a compliance function, a big change. But secondly, we see a big change in the nature of who ought to be a director. So instead of it's being essentially insiders plus informed outsiders, it's now the model is independent director, which is a person not employed by the firm, not beholden to the firm for fees or business. Next slide. Now, part of what pushes, what locks into place the Board 2.0 model is the Delaware courts, because the business failures of the 1.0 model led to a rise of hostile takeover bidders. And it turned out that firms that moved to the 2.0 model, firms that had independent directors, were able to, under the guidance of the Delaware courts, were able to insulate the management team from takeover bidders, were given authority to bless defensive measures. Secondly, the Delaware courts permitted this new board model with independent directors to provide the basis for special committees that could dismiss shareholder suits brought against directors in management. So, sort of to quote ourselves, CEOs thus embrace the presence of independent directors who could hold off two of management's most feared predators, hostile bidders and plaintiffs' lawyers. Next slide. So basically, and here I'll conclude. So what we see, again, we had a 1.0 model, and it collapsed and transformed itself over a relatively short period of time. And that's reflected in the way that a figure shows shifts in the composition of the board over a 25-year period, the black line, the bottom line, shows the fraction of independent directors, and the top line, the gray, shows the fraction of inside directors, and the transformation is really profound. And the final slide, next slide. And there's another graph that again shows how the collapse of the 1.0 model being replaced by the 2.0 model is reflected in the dramatic shift in the ratio of independent to inside directors occurring, as these things go over a relatively short period of time. So I'm now going to turn the story over to Ron, who's going to suggest in his own way that the board, in a sense, we've shown how the board is evolution in action, and the board 2.0 model is not, in a sense, the end of history when it comes to the evolution of boards.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. If I stumble, it's because I'm looking at a number of different screens, none of which are the same, which adds a little bit of uncertainty to what I observe. The framing of the board 1.0, board 2.0, ultimately maybe board 3.0, can be expressed as if the board 1.0 does not operate well in the period in which it developed, and the same point can be made with respect to board 2.0. Both of those, as Jeff has indicated, are wrong. The creation of the board 1.0 screen wasn't as Chandler develops it. It wasn't a corporate governance device at all. It was a way of internally managing business organizations that were becoming remarkably larger, remarkably more complicated, and requiring remarkably more skill than it had before. So board 1.0 worked just fine until we began to see the fit between the board and changed economic conditions and organizational skills happening elsewhere in the economy. The next step, which was where Jeff and I decided to change horses in the presentation, is with a period in which we get a deterioration of the fit between the board 2.0 model with independent directors who are charged with monitoring, and where we are now talking about a governance, about board 2.0 as a corporate governance device, as opposed to board 1.0, which was the development of a managerial structure to run complex organizations. So the first point that is important to make is the board, who's the monitor in this setting, the ability to run compliance programs, the ability to make good faith judgments about what's working and what's not, depends on the information flow that's going to a group of part-time directors who will meet 8 to 12 times a year with thanks to computers, a blessedly small board books, because you can carry them on planes, but literally getting information that is essentially channeled through management. So the structure is one in which the monitors get only that information that it has gotten through the board function, through board meetings and board distributions, which are driven by the CEO and individuals who are in the CEO's direct reports. There are some efforts, there have been some efforts to adjust to this. The movement toward, at least as I've always understood it, the movement towards independent chairs wasn't to affect, its function wasn't to affect how the business was being run. It was to provide certainty that the board had access to information that it wanted. So, step one, the scale and complexity of businesses began to grow, and the capacity of a part-time independent board dependent on management for its information became a continued problem. Let's remember, as an example, one of the embarrassments associated with Enron. The chair of the Enron Audit Committee was the former dean of the Stanford Business School and probably one of the most talented academic accountants of his generation. So that the capacity for the board to make sure it wasn't getting fooled, the board's capacity to make sure that a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility is being maintained in a quality, with quality and methods that will assure when the FDA inspects the plant, we don't get a failure and a reduction in output. We've seen that with the vaccine production in Brooklyn, but Abbott Laboratories, major pharmaceutical chain, was forced to close down two of its most important manufacturing facilities for a period of months until they could get it recertified. The information flow to the board wasn't sufficient for it to do precisely the monitoring that it had to do with respect to the company's single most important facilities, that is being able to manufacture the product that it had. Second, so first we got the information process beginning to be out of control of the board. Second, we have an understaffed board. There's a flow of information. The board is reliant on senior management for being able to effectively use that. There is typically no dedicated staff. And remember, as we're talking about part-time. The third point, which Jeff has stressed to me repeatedly, is that the directors are undermotivated. Their limited extent to which their compensation keys on performance of the business, that is the portion which is key to their option compensation, will typically not be sufficient to affect their overall wealth, so that doing really well doesn't directly translate into their compensation. But on the downside, doing badly results in a significant impact on their reputation. So we don't have a normal distribution of outcomes. There's a fat tail in the direction of the downside, which is a wonderful recipe for risk aversion. And to the extent that the part of the board 2.0's model is to participate in strategy, there's a set of incentives that push in the direction of risk aversion at a time when changes in the business world are such that being able to be, I'll use the current consulting phrase, the ability of an organization to be agile and make changes quickly in response to a rapidly changing competitive environment and a rapidly changing product environment becomes important. For all practical purposes, the board is walled off from the operation of that process. When in the same period we move toward a circumstance where the board's role with respect to takeovers, changes in control become important, the one role, that the board can importantly play is the monitoring of what the problem is supposed to be. From management side, the market is myopic. They don't have complete information. The result is they over discount the future, which pushes toward, as the argument runs, towards short-termism. That's one side of the distribution. The other side of the distribution is that management is hyperopic. That is, they're overconfident. They are deeply invested in their own strategy. And in effect, they hold an out-of-the-money call option. The result is the value of that option goes up with its term. And their incentives, as you work them out, are to run that strategy as long as they can, because sooner or later something good may happen. You can track General Motors quite nicely over the period with how long its business model and its manufacturing structures did not change despite a massive loss in market share. So thank you for switching the sides. The second thing that is, I think, absolutely, Jeff and I think is absolutely central to this process was the massive change in the complexity of the business environment that large public corporations were operating on, and without the capacity of the board to scale its own operation in order to reach it. So the example we use, or perhaps it's an anecdote, is to take JP Morgan and Co. in 76. We chose 76 because it was the year in which Mel Eisenberg published the iconic book that was the academic brief in favor of Board 2.0. And the little chart at the bottom of the slide just uses a very rough impressionistic measure of the complexity of JP Morgan's business in the period between 1976 and 2019. What we see is a 6,000% increase in revenue. We see about a 2,500% increase in the number of employees, and a roughly 625% increase in the number of countries in which it's working. Now, I say this is impressionistic. I mean that because if the board is playing the monitoring role, what we saw in 2008 is that part of that role is understanding the global risk management procedures that a major bank or a major manufacturer is operating on. Imagine how, for those of us who are not economists, but what shall I call us, economist groupies, the amount of time it will take in order to get to a point where we feel comfortable that we understand what a major global bank's risk management program actually is, before we talk about how much time it takes to monitor. The world is getting past this, getting past the board 2.0 structure in order to deal with the changing business environment. And that is that's the evolutionary model that Jeff describes. That is, the pressure comes when business conditions and competitive markets get ahead of the governance system and then changes. And it's that lack of fit that drives the chain. What we saw with our JP Morgan example was that it altered its board size over time. That is, in the at the beginning of the period that we track, JP Morgan had a General Motors size board in 1975. There were 24 directors. By 2002, it had dropped itself into a board 2.0 style, 11 or 12 directors. All but one, all but the CEO were independent. It had a structure which in form was fit board 2.0 just fine. Nonetheless, it failed to catch important things. The London Whale episode is the newspaper headline version of it, but JP Morgan wasn't alone. In some ways, Wells Fargo Bank is a better example. It came out of the financial crisis with a reputation of being extremely well managed. It had Warren Buffett as a large shareholder, and as a result of a finding both in courts and in its supervision by the federal government, what Wells Fargo did was essentially, across a wide variety of its consumer markets, it basically defrauded its customers. The result was an imposed replacement of essentially all of senior management and essentially all of its directors, and most importantly, the imposition of an almost unprecedented cap in the size of Wells Fargo's balance sheet, which basically froze the complexity of its operations until the Fed concluded that it was sufficiently managed, sufficiently well monitored to run it.
Ron, I'm
Yes.
getting notices that you and I are running into panel one. So
Okay, well then we're going to move this up, and can we move to the next slide, please? In short, we end up with board 2.0 that finds itself in a position in which the governance model ends up in a setting in which the independent directors, the center of board 2.0, are under-resourced. They don't have support. They're thinly informed because they don't have control over what information they get. And they're under-motivated because the internal compensation system pushes towards risk aversion. Can we go to the next slide, please? Where I'll close the deteriorating fit description is with a role that the board has could come to play in a setting which is dominated by capital markets in which there are dominant shareholders across the board. A handful of investment managers essentially can drive the outcomes of tension. The claim of companies is that it is difficult to get one's message across. One possibility is a board can serve as an intermediary between the public and the company, and serve as a reputation intermediary for management story if the board is operating in a sufficiently information-rich basis that it can be credible in playing that role. Okay, next slide, please. The problem is real, and it's this tension which Jeff and I are in the evolutionary process as creating increased tension, in creating increased tension between the role that needs to be played and what the board 2.0 model is capable of playing in the current environment. Can I have next slide, please? It's at this point that we begin to pivot. We begin to see the pivot toward board 3.0, along with other of Mike Jensen's remarkable work, not the least of which was the creation of SSRN. He writes in an intentionally attention-grabbing title, "The Eclipse of the Public Corporation," that it is the governance model of private equity that allows the creation of a better informed, better supported, and better motivated management structure. The important thing about his point, and then we will be very close to being done, is that there are alternatives for what let's take the period when Michael was talking about what a leverage buyout does without a control transfer. A leverage recap will accomplish essentially the identical result of an LBO, except without a change in the governance structure. And the need for a change in that governance structure is what motivated Jeff and my focus on board 3.0. Next slide, please. So what's the point? We're trying to push a very, very big tent orientation toward something that we've just called Board 3.0. It tries to fashion a place for empowered directors who can be independently informed, who are sufficiently resourced and motivated that they can operate with the speed and the intensity that the present environment requires. Let me close with just by posing another anecdote with another company that's dear to my heart, because I was when I arrived where I am now, the electricity went out. California Utilities, and PG&E is the best example. It is a terribly run company operationally, in terms of monitoring, and especially in terms of performance. Question becomes, how do you change it? Rebecca Henderson's work on internal implicit contract identifies that we have the people who have to be convinced are the workforce, both about what the new rules are and to credibly believe they will be changed. That the right thing for people who are inspecting the vegetation in the right of way of its electric lines understand that they're supposed to actually tell the truth as opposed to always come back with no necessity. That requires a different governance structure than we have. That's the goal of this exercise. And to be clear, we're not offering a blueprint of what a particular form of board 3.0 is going to look like. It's going to differ. It's going to differ depending on the particular company, the particular market, the ability of major companies to be able to affect a shift from vertical integration to supply chains. And that's going to be different, but it does share a common core. And that's the point I'll stop with. We need a board structure that can provide thickly informed directors, not thinly informed directors, that can provide thickly resourced directors rather than thinly resourced directors who are motivated. And that's it's the part that Jeff and I have done is the easy part. It's designing those structures in particular companies operating increasingly through agile management that makes that interesting, but also makes it extremely hard.